Great to be with you today, and really happy to be joined by two pros in this space. Amy Andryszak, who's the president and CEO of Interstate Natural Gas Association of America, and Michael Skelly, who's the CEO of Grid United. So two folks that are very well versed on permitting issues. Before I ask the first question, I have heard folks in the green space, in the environmental space, and I've experienced it myself, trying to build ecological restoration projects where permitting has actually obstructed progress. And so for folks on the left, for folks involved in the environmental movement, heard them complain about permitting and regulation and how it's actually obstructed progress. And certainly folks on the right have been incredibly frustrated by the permitting process and development projects. So it's one of those rare instances where I think the left and the right are united. And so I'm hopeful that today we can chart a little bit of a course about, or building on the course that's been discussed today and how we can make some progress on this issue, finally. So with that, I want to ask you the first question. What are you most excited about, or where do you see the most opportunity for legislating on permitting moving forward? Amy?
So, I think we heard it actually in the closing remarks from the last panel. I think we are finally in a place where you've never seen so many stakeholders in agreement that we need permitting reform to build the infrastructure necessary for this country. And so that gives me a great deal of excitement that hopefully we can get to a legislative solution. And I think we saw some bipartisan agreement in the House last year as to what should be in that package. From Inga's perspective, we think that a permitting bill needs to have reforms to the Clean Water Act, to NEPA, and judicial review. And so we're excited that these seem to be consistent themes in legislation.
All right, Skelly, you heard it. What do you think?
So I would say, so first off, I work in electric power transmission, and pretty much everything that Amy would want, we would probably agree with, because she's working on pipelines, we're working on similar long linear infrastructure, and we deal with a lot of the same issues. And so things that are going to work well for pipeline in terms of timeframes and judicial review and limits on who can participate and make appeals and so on, those are all things that are helpful to getting transmission lines built as well. So I think you'll see a lot of agreement there. So we're very excited about that sort of common purpose. On the electric power side, we're most excited about some of the provisions that were at EPRA around transmission reform. And the big issue on transmission is we really haven't sorted out how to pay for the grid that I think we need and that many people think that we need. And you don't have to go very far back in time to see that. In fact, you just go back to last week. And what we saw was huge price differentials across the country, where electricity in some parts of the country cost, like 100 times as much as it did in other parts of the country. So what does that tell you when you have a challenge like when a market isn't working? It's a problem with the infrastructure, and that's a problem that we have with the grid. The other challenge that we saw last week with the grid was we came quite close to having reliability issues, and at PJM they had to call people up and say, hey, run your backup generators. Those are not the most efficient units, and if you're running your backup generator, then you don't have a backup anymore. Yeah. So the provisions that were in EPRA around new ways to get the grid planned and paid for are of great interest to us.
So we heard Amy talking about things like judicial review, things like 401 certification. Heard Skelly talk a little bit about some of the other parts of what has been viewed as a sort of entire or full permitting deal that includes some of the transmission and grid issues that are problematic or, in your opinion, holding things up. So, Skelly, let me come back to you. So you talked a little bit about consequences. You talked about price disparity. You talked about, or I'll actually perhaps embellish a bit on what you said. And we've got to meet demand. You've all seen the projections for growing demand for electricity through data centers. My refrigerator now talks to me, orders crap off the internet without me even knowing. I mean, all that takes electricity. It does. And so cars, EVs, electrification. So we're seeing increased demand. So what are the repercussions if permitting deal is not ultimately reached?
Well, I think that we're going to see more and more of these issues where we've got challenges in terms of big price spikes and either actual reliability incidents or near misses.
Okay, so let me jump in right there real quick. So you talked about affordability and reliability. So how does that come into play with this election cycle? You've heard the administration talking a lot about affordability. You've heard Republicans and Democrats on the Hill talking about affordability. So how does that come into play?
Well, I think that the sell here is, hey, there's different ways to deal with these challenges, but one way is by investing in the grid. If you invest in the grid that we need, that can deal with, it's not an immediate patch, but over the medium and long term, it will help.
It will help with affordability and reliability, therefore transcending politics.
Yes.
So what do you see, Amy, if we don't ultimately have a permitting deal enacted?
So two things. I want to pull on affordability first. And I think it's a basics of supply and demand. I mean, you see areas of the country where there isn't enough infrastructure, and so they can't get the necessary fuels, and those fuel prices go up in these peak periods. I mean, so affordability is a real issue. And if we don't build out the infrastructure we need to meet this demand, then we're not going to be delivering more affordable energy to both American consumers and businesses. And I have an example for you, if you don't mind. We've tracked that from 2013 to 2021, there were 5 natural gas pipelines that were supposed to be built in the Northeast. They actually all received their FERC certificates, but none of them moved forward due to trouble getting state certifications, litigation, rising costs. But if those 5 pipelines had been built, it would have been an additional 5 BCF a day of natural gas flowing in the Northeast. And that amount of gas keeps prices lower and helps with potential near-miss situations in extreme weather situations.
So real examples of what happens in exacerbating conditions in the Northeast and elsewhere if we're unable
Yeah,
to
but
move forward.
I can also throw out another example on the electric power side. So we did have enough power last week around the country. We just didn't have enough wires to get the power to where it was needed, and that resulted in the price spike. So we can deal with this load growth in 2 ways, and we do have to do it both ways. We can build more generation, and we can build more wires to get that generation to market. And it's sort of a question of like, how do we get the optimal mix of these 2? But if we get it right, we can save a lot of money.
Okay. So what we've seen over the past few administrations is we've seen policy-heavy moves on the environmental and on the permitting side. We watched the Obama administration come in and put policies in place. Then we saw pendulum swing back with the first Trump administration, swinging back even farther during the Biden administration, and now returning under Trump. If you're looking at tens of billions or even more in infrastructure investment, you're watching these wild pendulum swings. What does that do to investment? What does it do to investment certainty to FIDs? And do we actually need legislation, or should we just let administrations do all this through policy?
Well, on our side, it keeps competition to a minimum because most people go, I'm not getting in that business. Are you out of your mind? Because it really is difficult to develop projects that can take, 5, 10 years with these ups and downs and policy. So that's an unfortunate side. We just don't have the amount of competition that we need, and that, has the predictable effect on prices and so on.
It's like what the NIL and the transfer portal have done to the SEC. All right, so Amy, could you answer that question?
Sure. So, I mean, similar thing. I mean, when there is lack of certainty, it makes it harder to secure the necessary investments to build out projects. There's less interest in moving forward with these developments. In the case of natural gas pipelines, we are seeking 10 to 20-year contracts from our customers to build these pipelines. And if there is the concern that building that pipeline could take 3 to 6 years, it just makes it harder to secure those types of long lead contracts.
So again, uncertainty chills investment, and it undermines long-term financing and creates challenges. Totally makes sense. So let's get into some more specific areas. In the opening, you talked about Clean Water Act, and of course the 401 certification has been a big issue, and of course that's the issue of where states have the ability to certify Clean Water Act permits and determine whether or not they're consistent with state plans, and therefore it effectively allows states to stop interstate transmission or interstate pipeline projects moving forward. Now, Amy, most people have looked at this issue as being more of a pipeline issue, but in reality, it's lateral infrastructure. So can you talk about that a little bit, about how you view this Clean Water Act issue and whether you view it as being strictly pipelines or if you think it has broader consequences?
So, clearly I've looked at it through the pipeline perspective, but we believe at INGA that everything we've advocated for as it relates to statutory permitting reform would help any long linear infrastructure, to your point. And that's true of Clean Water Act, and you really summed it up well. What we have seen happening, so there are a role for states. You get your FERC certification, but then states give you your water quality certification permit. And there have been states who don't want more pipeline infrastructure, and they have used the permits to stop those projects. And so back to your question on, do we need legislation? Yes, I think we do need statutory legislation that stops the ability of states to impede projects based on their own sort of policy prescriptions. In terms of, our view, again, Clean Water Act, NEPA, judicial reform would help all forms of infrastructure. Skelly can probably speak to that even more than I can.
Skelly, obviously you have an opinion here. Lateral transmission, most folks just look at it, the 401 issue, as a pipeline issue. How does it impact transmission?
Well, the 401 process brings in a whole host of other federal agencies and so on, when you're dealing with Army Corps and so on. So it's another sort of, the whole process is very fragile. The process of building anything linear is super fragile. There's so many moving pieces. And this is just another element of fragility and vulnerability to a project. So if you want to be against a project, there's so many weak points in the process that if you can kind of get yourself in there at any one of these processes, it's sort of like, every time you got a bowl, I don't really know how to bowl, but I think you can get to 300 if you knock all the pins down at once.
So you tell me
you got to do that like 3 times in a row.
To become a plaintiff's attorney? Is that what you're telling me right now?
So it's you just got to we got to be right like 1,000 times, and if we're wrong once, like back to zero.
And just to follow up on that point, because I think it's a great point. What we have seen in terms of these delays, we talk about why does it take so long? Because we are now seeing litigation at every single step of the permitting process. So we talk a lot about clean water permits. We also get clean air permits. There are a variety of different state and local permits. And opposition to additional infrastructure is starting to sue at every step along the way, and that's adding a lot of time and money to the build out of infrastructure.
I'm going to throw a because we've been so incredibly efficient, and we're going to return time back. It's going to be amazing. But
we're just getting going here, so don't promise them anything.
I'm curious about your thoughts on, we had this 7-county Supreme Court decision that happened last year that most people probably didn't read, but it really was a pretty profound decision. And I think if that decision had been in place when EPRA was being negotiated in the end of 24, I think it actually would have had a big impact on negotiations, because what the Supreme Court said in the unanimous decision was that they viewed NEPA as a procedural statute, and that the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, and other natural resource authorities were sort of the primary space there. So do you have any thoughts on how you see the interface between, like how should NEPA, and just to pick on one law, how should NEPA sort of operate in light of the 7 counties decision? And should it come in and re-review things like Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act? Anyone have thoughts there?
So basically, the way we look at what 7 counties did is that it really limited what an agency should be looking at when they do an environmental review of a project. So essentially, when they're coming in to do the environmental review, they should only be looking at that which exists within an agency's direct authority. And so it helps put guardrails on the environmental review process. And that's part of the importance of what 7 counties decided. Now, back to your question of do we need legislation? Again, the answer is yes, because that's a Supreme Court decision. At some point, an agency is going to do something that may or may not be deemed within the scope of their direct authority. It's going to be challenged. It's going to go back to the courts. It's going to continue to be litigated. If we can get some of these same guardrails into statute, again, it helps shore up this permitting process.
Yeah. Thanks, Amy. Skelly?
Yeah, so 7 counties helps. So I wish I had like a unified theory of like exactly how we ought to do this, okay? But it does
That's
feel
going to be my next question. So
a lot more like we should, let's get the facts out, okay? And then have, a body make a decision. Like that feels like the direction. But I got to tell you, sometimes my head, I'm getting a little confessional here, turns into soup on some of this stuff. Because when we're doing these projects, our environmental team comes to me and says, well, Skelly, next we got to do this. And I'm like, do we have to do that? They're like, well, if we don't, okay, let's do it. And then we got this other thing, and the other thing, and the other thing. And this goes on and on and on at tremendous cost, okay? And we know that because everything is procedural, if we miss one process and some opponent pops up somewhere along the way, we are done. So we're we're going through a minefield, and when you go through a minefield, you want to go very slowly and very carefully. So this is a long answer to your question, but getting to the point where we can let's disclose what's happening, and then let's try to maximize everything we can do to maximize environmental outcomes is if we can figure out some way to do that. Because I got to tell you, it is so maddening to do all this stuff that does nothing for the environment, okay? That all it does is provide employment for consultants and lawyers. And I love them both, but man, I wish we could spend more money on getting projects done and, jobs, people building things, and improving infrastructure, as opposed to just,
I'm going to cut you off right there because I'm actually a consultant. To hell with you if you're gonna trash my industry. That's how. No, I'm kidding, Skelly.
I said I love them. I do love them. But in doses.
All right. So Amy, I'm going to give you a twofer on this one. Then Skelly, to come back to you on closing on your sort of prognosis for permitting reform. So can you answer the question what are your thoughts on the prognosis for permitting reform, but also what that certainty provides to you?
So again, I'm going to go back to what we said earlier. I think that we have a great opportunity for permitting reform. I think there's never been more agreement on the need. And so I am very hopeful that now is the time, and that that we can move together with a bipartisan comprehensive bill. And then that certainty, again, would help with the efficient build out of more natural gas pipeline infrastructure, which is needed really to help not only LNG exports, but also this demand for the data centers and AI, and for the U.S. to be winning that AI race.
My refrigerator. Yeah. Thank you. Skelly, can we get it done?
So I live in Texas, okay? And you can't, if you put a Texan on a panel, you're going to get them bragging about Texas. So in Texas, we are building a doing a huge transmission expansion, 765 lines. There were attempts to kill renewables in the last session. Oil and gas and lots of other folks teamed up and beat back those efforts. So we're building all kinds of solar. Wind is still getting built. A huge transmission expansion, tens of billions of dollars to serve new loads in oil and gas. So we kind of figured it out there. Now, it's not the exact template for what we might do as a country, but there's lots of disagreements in Texas about where energy should come from and so on. But we are building the infrastructure to tap all these sources. So maybe there's some lessons learned there.
All right. Well, look, in wrapping up, I think we heard a lot of talk about where they have some middle ground. During negotiations with the Biden administration a few years ago, we came very close to getting judicial review in exchange for doing kind of an education or information certainty, meaning if we spend a little bit more money on educating the public on a permit application, that they would trade that for judicial review and reducing the amount of time down to a shorter period of time, which I know provides certainty for financial decisions and others that's really important. 401 certification and talking through perhaps how to tie that back to an actual state plan or federal objectives is perhaps a second area where this could be done. I think where some of the challenges or headwinds are going to come is in the transmission component, because in the House you don't have a lot of muscle memory, and I think we've seen challenges there where Congressman Guthrie, Chairman Guthrie, and Latta and others have been I think interested, but at the same time a little bit concerned because some of the pushes, as we've seen in legislation in the past, have been these sort of looking at national solutions, which you know really well, doing things that are more prescriptive in the different RTOs and trying to be more prescriptive to the actual problems around the country on transmission, I think would see less headwinds as we move forward. But bottom line is that this can be done. I think it must be done. Continuing to see these wild pendulum swings under different administrations doesn't give the certainty. I think it freezes billions and billions of dollars in investment, and it prevents us from being able to meet the demands that we see currently and in the future to achieve reliability and affordability.
That's it.
You got it. All right. Well, hey, thank you all very much. Enjoy the break. Appreciate it.
Thanks to BPC.